It's the week ending Saturday 16th of June, and this is the Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the World Cup kicking off in Russia, the UK remembering the victims of Grenfell Tower, and Donald Trump claiming victory in peace talks with North Korea. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Rebecca Gilley. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me from the week's digital team are Hollie Clemence, Holden Frith and Jamie Timson. And to start the show this week, it's Hollie. What should this week be remembered for?
Are we getting dumb and dumberer?
Looking back across lots of intelligence test score data, it turned out that the average IQ had been rising decade on decade, right across the 20th century. It looks about 3 IQ points per decade. People were getting smarter. What this new data tells us is that in around the 1970s, at least in Norway, and there is some other evidence from other countries as well, that increase actually started to turn into a decline. So we're seeing a kind of reverse Flynn effect.
That was cognitive ageing expert Stuart Ritchie speaking this week to Sky News. So, Hollie, are we all getting dumb and dumberer?
As Stuart Ritchie says, it's a latest study from the Ragnar Frisch Centre in Oslo, and it suggests there's a long trend of increasing IQs, but now it's taken a turn. Described by James Flynn, he kind of discovered it in the 1980s, that we've been increasing IQ points by about 3 points per decade from 1932 to 1978, and this seems to be kind of in decline from 1975.
Okay, so it's a stagnation. Is it a reversal? We're actively getting stupider?
Literally a reversal. I mean, this study's just in Norway, but there have been other examples in France, UK, Denmark, Finland, Estonia.
Jamie, is this all about us or is it about the tests?
It's all about you. What's happening?
Not me personally.
Yeah, you personally.
Oh, damn it.
That's it. I'm going on the offensive. Now Ollie's not here. There's no one holding me back.
What's the problem with what's going on? Is it the people taking the tests or are the tests becoming outdated? Obviously, the world has changed a lot since the first IQ tests.
I think that there's quite a problem with the concept of IQ tests. I imagine these IQ tests these days haven't been updated to really harness the idea of what modern intelligence is. I mean, there was a study in 2012, one of the largest studies, that showed that actually there isn't such a thing as general intelligence. There's 3 types of intelligence.
Well, I was going to say it's important to distinguish there is a difference between IQ and intelligence.
Intellectual ability and just having modern intelligence. So this study in 2012 found that there tends to be 3 types of intelligence: short-term memory, reasoning, and verbal agility. And there's actually no correlation between how highly you score in one over the other. You'd imagine then that a generalised IQ test is unable to really gather that much evidence about how intelligent people are these days.
I think one explanation for why there was this persistent long-term rise in the 20th century is that the standard IQ tests are looking for a particular, quite technical form of intelligence, which has a lot to do with spotting patterns in series of numbers and in sort of space or objects. And the kind of long drift from an agricultural economy to a more industrial and mechanical economy meant that those skills were more valued and were taught more in schools, but also were just more part of people's lives. So people became better at answering those sorts of questions. You might expect that in the last 30 years or so, when we've moved from an industrial to more information-based economy, maybe some of those technical skills have been less valued and other skills which aren't being captured by those tests are perhaps rising instead.
And the style of questions that are asked, these more abstract questions, have been cited in the past as the reason that people in the developed world tend to perform better than people in the developing world on IQ tests, which is something that's been controversial with IQ testing because it's been seized upon by certain segments of society to, try and show a supposed difference in intelligence. Does this mean that the developed world has got as intelligent as it's going to get? And is the developing world then going to catch up?
This does seem to be one interpretation of the results, and certainly up until now it seemed that the closer your social or educational background was to the people who set the tests, i.e. white male American academics, the better you were going to do in those tests. Those gaps have been closing. Women have closed the gap on men. Poorer countries have closed the gap on richer countries. One possible explanation is that those previously disadvantaged groups have actually had better access to education, and so they have fulfilled more of their untapped potential than previously. Another possible explanation is just that in our kind of globalized way of living, there's less of a cultural and social gap between anyone regardless of their gender or location.
So the headlines obviously have all been about this idea that we're all getting stupider. But what else did the researchers find?
It's interesting, it was looking at the reasons why those IQ levels might be declining. Going back to last week when we were talking about eugenics, this week we're going to dysgenics. This is kind of the opposite thing. There was a theory that less intelligent people were having more children. However, this study suggests the causes are environmental rather than this kind of genetic reason, because they looked at within family statistics. So it's health, nutrition, education, like we were talking about, rather than a kind of genetic reason.
So did they find that children are getting stupider than their parents?
That is the theory if you judge it by IQ levels.
There have been previous studies that were throwing up suggestions as to what the kind of social factors of these are. Particularly there was one that was saying that technology is effectively causing a kind of dumbing down of kids, because the things that you were able to do as a 5-year-old in 1994, say, you're actually no longer able to do. But that could be a variety of things. It could be a change in education. I mean, we already know that technology is fundamentally changing the brain structure.
Is it because of Google?
Well, yeah. I mean, certainly if you look at, I think there have been studies that have shown that the makeup of the brain and the way that you store memories is changing among young people because of the ability to be able to Google things. You don't need to these days have to store that many facts if you have something in your phone that can tell you everything in the world ever. That's
true, but then IQ tests aren't general knowledge tests for that specific reason. Do you think there's something deeper?
But it will affect the way that your brain creates and stores memories, so you'll be unable to do so well on generalised intelligence tests.
Holden?
And a lot of the questions do revolve around spotting patterns in numbers. And I think we all just manipulate numbers in our heads. I mean, we don't even really remember people's phone numbers anymore. And so I think that lack of familiarity with numbers could affect, I mean, this is me speculating rather than any research.
Not speculate wildly.
I think that could affect your performance in the test, even if it's not actually a reflection of your underlying intelligence. It's just that we're doing less well in IQ tests because we're less good at answering the kind of questions that are included in IQ tests.
So, Holly, does this mean that we should be worried? Does this mean that IQ tests are just outdated and we need a new one for the 21st century? Or should we start making plans for what the world's going to look like as we all get steadily stupider?
It's definitely debatable among scientists, but I think obviously health, nutrition and education need to be at the forefront of any kind of government's policies, education particularly if children aren't being educated as well. But then there's this argument that they're just being educated differently. Like you say, maybe we read less books, but people are better at perhaps coding or things that are needed by industry. So has industry suddenly collapsed because our IQ levels have gone down? Probably not. People are still publishing interesting scientific or technological, inventing new things. There's all sorts of things that are still happening. The world hasn't suddenly slowed down because maybe our brains appear to have slowed down according to IQ tests. So I don't think it's the end of the world.
Have any of you guys ever taken an IQ test?
When I was young, but I think my brain might have frazzled since then.
What was your score?
Mensa. Just can't remember. Mensa. My memory's gone.
Yeah.
I did a sort of IQ test for an American university application, but it wasn't one that gave you a score.
Did you get
based on? I did get in.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, top score.
No, I don't tend to want to test
what
my brain's doing.
I can tell.
It's not worth it.
Next up this week, it's Holden. Holden, what do you think this week will be remembered for?
I've been wondering whether this is the week that complacency became more of a threat than ignorance.
There is now a danger that has become a threat to us all. It is a deadly disease and there is no known cure. The virus can be passed during sexual intercourse with an infected person. Anyone can get it, man or woman. So far, it's been confined to small groups. But it's spreading. So protect yourself. And read this leaflet when it arrives. If you ignore AIDS, it could be the death of you. So don't die of ignorance.
That was a very ominous warning, but it couldn't help but sound like quite a dated one as well. What's the story this week?
Well, this is a story about unintended consequences and the way that people making seemingly rational decisions can end up putting themselves and other people at risk. It stems from a study published in Australia of gay and bisexual men who said they were having casual sex, i.e. one of the higher risk groups for contracting HIV. And it found that between 2013 and 2017, consistent use of condoms fell from 46% to 31%, so quite a marked drop.
Okay, and what was responsible for this?
There's a couple of factors involved. In the sort of slightly longer term, condom use had been dropping generally, and that had been put down to more effective treatments for HIV, which reduced the likelihood of it being passed on, but also increased the chances of eradicating the symptoms and reducing the seriousness of it. And also just the fading in the kind of collective memory of these sorts of public information films that we had, which were regarded as highly successful in limiting the spread. But the other more recent factor, according to this study, was the growth in the use of preventative drugs called pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP.
And so what is PrEP, Jamie, and what does it do?
It's effectively a drug that eliminates the threat of catching and passing on HIV.
So
you're able to take it as someone who perhaps would be at risk of contracting HIV.
Okay, so it's not a treatment, it's taken by people who don't currently
have it. So the theory obviously goes that people are then partaking in unsafe sex without condoms because they have eradicated the idea of catching or contracting HIV. But we have seen, particularly in the groups most at risk to HIV, a uptick in other forms of sexually transmitted diseases like syphilis and chlamydia has been trailed quite a lot recently. There's like super high-powered gonorrhea.
Yeah, because this drug doesn't protect you from other forms of
it's very
STI.
specific. It's very specific to HIV. So the idea is that despite the fact that they're knowing that they themselves are safe, they're becoming less risk-averse.
And interestingly, one of the results from this study was actually even people who are not taking PrEP have reduced their use of condoms over this 4-year period. There was some good news too, in that actually HIV transmission has reduced substantially even with this reduction of condom use, because PrEP has created a sort of herd immunity in the way that you get with measles vaccinations, in that if you reduce the overall incidence of an infection within the population, even people who aren't protecting themselves still benefit from the people who are.
I think there's an interesting overview more generally about sexual health, in that a lot of the kind of major funding that went into sexual health came after the AIDS epidemic in the 80s. And now, for a variety of reasons, sexual health funding is getting cut by this government. And there is a feeling that people are ignoring the issues or the problems that's occurring with sexual health because we are getting, as Holden says, further and further away from the AIDS epidemic as a real issue.
But do you think that the spectre of that epidemic is causing people to be more complacent about other forms of STIs, which, we've been hearing can be extremely dangerous? And these days, having super gonorrhea is more dangerous than having HIV if you have the right drugs to treat you. Do you think that kind of justified hysteria is causing us to lose sight of other dangerous diseases?
Perhaps there is less awareness of those other STIs. I think you're right, because there's been so much about AIDS and HIV over the years. People do see that as the worst scenario, and maybe the others, in a risk assessment, in your mind, you might see the others as less dangerous. It may be comparable to when the contraceptive pill first came out in the 1960s, kind of created the swinging 60s itself. People were living more freely. I wonder if there's just a period of change now, and then it will settle down and maybe more warnings will come out and people will go back to being slightly safer.
Holden, isn't this human nature? As the risk declines, more people are willing to take the risk in the first place. We see that kind of behaviour in other scenarios maybe as well.
Yeah, certainly. I think it is a rational decision, as I said in the introduction, that if you can protect yourself from what has been presented as the single biggest risk for this group, then removing that risk is going to make you feel safer. There are other examples of this sort of behaviour. Research has shown that when seatbelts were made compulsory in cars, people started to drive more quickly because they felt invulnerable. I would imagine, I couldn't find any research to support it, but the rise of anti-malarials has probably led to people travelling to areas of greater risk and perhaps putting themselves at risk of other diseases that they can't protect themselves against. So
do we need some terrifying new public information films about other STIs?
Yeah, I think it's possible. Both Jamie and Holly have mentioned the idea of drug-resistant strains of other STDs. So it's the retreat of HIV as an automatic death sentence, certainly in the Western world, is part of what's behind this. But it could well be, if antibiotic resistance continues to grow, that syphilis and gonorrhea could themselves become much more dangerous, and that could lead to a return to more traditional ways of people protecting themselves.
It's also about education, I think, as well. Obviously, coming from a kind of inner city London, which has had like a huge amount of teenage pregnancy and STI. I think Lewisham actually had its own strain of chlamydia.
Named after it?
So you could basically, when they looked at the strain, they knew that the person had sex in Lewisham because it had been so, which is where I'm from.
Something to be proud of.
Something to be proud of. It's one of the few things to really, yeah. But it is to do with education, and I think that the further away that you come from the AIDS epidemic, and also the less ability that young people have to access the right kind of information about sexual health and about sexual well-being, the worse it gets.
And the other thing just to note at the end is that condom use, although it has been declining amongst gay men, is actually still higher than it is amongst heterosexual couples. In some areas, HIV transmission rates have actually been rising faster amongst straight couples than amongst gay couples. So one of the lessons really of the anti-HIV campaign in the early days was that it had to be presented as a risk to everyone, not just to somebody else and other people.
So more terrifying public information films for all. And finally this week, it's Jamie. Jamie, what do you think this week will be remembered for?
Was this the week that we all settled down in front of the ogle box?
I do find him very pleasing, I have to say, Aidan Turner, who plays Ross Poldark. And yes, I hate period drama. And the whole reason I got into Poldark, I'll be honest, is I saw that photograph, that publicity photograph of him shirtless, and I thought, I'll give this a wee watch. You never know. Sunday night, it was winter, it was quite cold at the time. And I know a lot of the papers are making that parallel.
You don't get many comforts these days, either.
What? No, I don't get many comforts.
Comfort.
Yeah. That's emergency.
Emergency comfort.
A lot of people in the papers are making that parallel. Why is it all right for women and it's not all right for men, etc.? And I think this is a really important point, isn't it? That we have always appreciated the human form. We have. You go back to the ancient Greeks, ancient Romans, wherever. Since civilization, we have always appreciated the human form. I think what we should worry about is an abuse of power and exploitation. And that's the key point.
That was Kay Adams speaking earlier this month on ITV's Loose Women. Jamie, was she speaking for you? What are you bringing to the table?
If there's a one group of women that always speak for me, it is our friends on the Loose Women panel. I don't really like some of the new people. But partially the reason I brought this was that over the past 2 episodes of the Graham Norton Show on BBC One on Friday, there have been, it wasn't the past 2, it was a gap, but Aidan Turner was on it and Channing Tatum. And the reaction of the guests and the audience to them, a lot of particularly with Channing Tatum, who was last week, a lot of the questions were about him and his body. I mean, it's a great body. He looks great.
Undeniably.
Even now, Magic Mike was a great film. But
you're perving now, you're perving.
It was, but it was that element of objectification and I was talking with friends while we were watching it, and we were saying that wouldn't be acceptable for them to do this about a female actor in the same way.
And so this has been kind of a rumbling, ongoing debate since Poldark went on the air, and obviously prior to that as well. It's back in the news recently because of a Radio Times interview with Mariella Frostrup. What did she say?
She said that, as a woman, I can own a comment about Aidan Turner, Poldark's chest, without censure. But she said that she felt, at least, that there was an element of double standards. If a male colleague had said the same thing about any of Turner's equally appealing female co-stars, his cries of contrition would be drowned out by Twitter's troll chorus. That was what she said. She argued that we're losing not only our sense of humour, but our sense of proportion as we throw every act of perceived sexism into the Me Too, #MeToo basket. Her argument is basically that people should be able to ogle, as I said earlier, both male and female, willy-nilly, freely.
Strange choice of words. But she's really taken kind of the opposite perspective, because we've been hearing a lot about how we should stop publicly perving over people. And she kind of went with the opposite, that maybe we should all be free to comment on people's bodies on screen. Holly, what do you think? Is there a double standard, and is it okay?
I think there is a double standard, especially on an individual level. I don't know how Aidan Turner and Channing Tatum felt, but objectifying women is different, in my view, to objectifying men. Gender pay gap still exists. Men still dominate the upper echelons of politics and industry. You're far more likely to get sexually harassed as a woman. The difference when women are objectified, it tends to set us back, whereas a man is objectified, their role is less fragile in society.
Holden, as a man, would you agree with that? When you are obviously objectified, on the regular.
It happens every day.
Yeah. Do you personally feel like there is, obviously context is everything, but on a personal level, do you think men do feel objectified by women, or do they feel flattered?
It's probably more at the flattery end of the scale, which is partly actually because of what Holly was saying about the power imbalance there. And I think I would tend to agree with both Holly and Mariella Frostrup that in an ideal world, everyone, whether they're male or female, could compliment, flirt with anyone who they found attractive. But to get to that slightly weird utopia, I think we'd have to remove the power imbalance so that the flirty could tell the flirter to get lost if they weren't comfortable with it.
I think we don't live in a vacuum as well. Like, the point is that history has shown that men, time and time again, particularly the media, portray women as nothing more than their bodies and put women out on show and don't look at the actor's prowess or the character behind it or what the woman is doing, and they use it to sell newspapers. One of my favourite things, actually on a slightly tangential point, that I saw last year was Lubina Hamid's Turner Prize winning, where she took The Guardian, front pages of The Guardian, and showed how the media portrayed black people and the words that were used and the ideas behind it, and just showed that even The Guardian does conform to racial stereotyping. And the same is true for women. The amount of times that a pretty shot of a woman on a front page is used to sell something that's completely different from anything to do with the thing, exists. So it would be great, as Holden says, to live in Holden's flirty utopia. But I do think that we probably at the moment are in so much of an imbalance that there needs to be some kind of form of reparations, I guess.
And Stockholm has just brought in a law that's going to make it illegal to have sexist advertising, so anything that objectifies men or women or promotes gender stereotypes. So this obviously is a problem when we see it around us, but does it also undermine acting? After all, acting is a craft and a profession, and should we really be making these kinds of superficial, sexualized comments about people who are just trying to do their jobs?
I think you'd also have to look at how many women have been employed to be in films and TV on basically the role because they're pretty. Are there enough roles out there of meaty roles for women where they actually have a personality or a character or putting something across other than their looks? And I'm not sure that balance is there either. Same in advertising. Men have got more money, so they're advertised too, the male gaze, so there's more females half naked on television in the adverts rather than men. Like the Diet Coke advert itself was new because it was a man that was kind of being ogled by the women. Maybe sexist because they're also an element of double standards, but I think the fact that it's in a minority of adverts just says a lot about the power imbalance.
But there is a weird double standard going on as well, in that while the Me Too movement is, at its peak and everyone's very interested in, eliminating sexism, people are tuning in their millions to Love Island, which essentially is just watching a bunch of pretty people strut around in swimwear.
Yeah, I love it. No, I think you're right. I think that the key thing is about context, and on the whole, people shouldn't take that whole idea too seriously. Love Island is a perfect example of people not taking the concept of, all of the think pieces that have been written over the past 2 or 3 weeks about Love Island and linking it to, should they know about Brexit, have actually taken it beyond the point of parody to the point where I think that actually there probably is a double standards going on, but it's okay. It's okay to have double standards.
The Graham Norton example is an interesting one because you've got the extra complexity there of it being a gay man ogling a straight man, which I think 20 years ago, when it would have been entirely fine for a male presenter to openly flirt with a female actor, and it would have been seen as aggressive and unacceptable for a gay male presenter in the same position to do something towards men. But now I think it's become a kind of win-win, both because there isn't that imbalance of power there, but also in kind of PR and identity politics, both stand to gain. So Graham Norton can demonstrate that he's comfortable with who he is, he's not hiding anything, but Channing Tatum can also demonstrate that he's secure in his own sexuality, he's entirely comfortable with this position, and that he doesn't feel threatened by it, and that makes him look good too.
Isn't there a certain segment of the population who would say that this just goes to show how gay and female sexuality is now prized in our society and straight male sexuality is being demonized? I mean, is there any truth to that? As you say, if we saw a male presenter flirting with an uncomfortable female star, we would all feel it was unacceptable.
I think it is a double standard, But it's inevitable because there has been a kind of systematic male oppression of women in a way that there hasn't been of straight men by gay men. And so I think we're in a period where there is a bit of an overreaction, but people are being probably more careful than they really should have to be. And some people who mean no offence and probably are giving no offence are being swept up in it. But if that's a process we have to go to in order to get to a place where people can feel more comfortable in themselves, then I think that's what we have to do.
It's also interesting what you brought up just about male sexuality being kind of poo-pooed or demeaned in a way, because there has been a lot of stuff in the media recently, I mean, particularly people like Jordan Peterson, and that argument that men, or certainly a facet of straight white men effectively, do feel in some way put upon. Everyone else is allowed to be celebrating, like you're saying, Graham Norton's allowed to do it, Channing Tatum's a big fan of it. Why is it that we are constantly on at the moment with the Me Too, what is that? And people do feel like there are people who feel attacked by it. So we are hopefully moving towards a situation where everyone can. I'm all for Holden's flirty utopia, that's what I'm saying.
As long as it doesn't come to the workplace. That's it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Jamie Timson, Hollie Clemence and Holden Frith. Please take a minute to rate, review and subscribe to The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. Every review helps us reach more listeners. I've been Rebecca Gilley. Our music is by Tom Morby. The producer is Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, goodbye.